You could feel it in the air, chills, chaos, and the loudest pop of the year. Her return just broke SmackDown history. But what is a pop? Really? It's not just noise. It's a sound, a physical thing. It's the sudden, violent displacement of air caused by 10,000 people leaping to their feet at the exact same millisecond. It's a collective gasp that turns into a roar. It is the sound of disbelief tonight. That sound was a weapon. The moment the music hit, that first, iconic chord, it wasn't a cheer. It was an explosion. People in the front row grabbed their heads. Grown men who had watched for 20 years suddenly looked like children again, their faces wet with tears they didn't even know they were crying. The broadcast cameras shook, not from an earthquake, but from the sheer vibration of the concrete foundations. Commentators, paid to speak, were silent. They couldn't. They wouldn't. They understood that this was not a moment to talk over. This was a moment to survive. The energy was so thick, so pure, it was almost terrifying. This wasn't just a return, this was a resurrection. And as she stood there, silhouetted in the entranceway, soaking in the thunder, one thing became terrifyingly clear. The person the fans were screaming for. She wasn't just a wrestler anymore. She was an idea. She was a savior. And that is a very, very dangerous thing to be. The show had stopped. The script was irrelevant. History was being written right now by the roar of the crowd. 500 feet away, behind a black curtain in the chaos of the gorilla position, the reaction was very different. There was no pop. There was only silence. The lead producer, headset clamped on, just dropped his clipboard. It clattered to the floor and no one even flinched. All eyes were glued to the monitor. They saw the same thing the fans saw, but they heard something different. They heard the sound of their plans turning to dust. The wrestler who was supposed to go out next, the one who had been practicing her promo all week, just slowly sat down on an anvil case. What was the point? How do you follow that? The rest of the women's locker room, it was a portrait of cold realization. This wasn't a celebration for them. This was an invasion. They had been scratching and clawing all year, building stories, bleeding for inches of television time. And in 3 seconds of music, she had just stolen the sun. It was envy, it was resentment, but mostly it was fear. The champion, who was watching from her private dressing room, felt a cold pit in her stomach. She held the title, the physical representation of being the best. But that sound, that deafening, worshipful roar, told her that the title didn't matter. The fans had just chosen their champion, and she wasn't it. The game had changed, the script was torn up, and the ghost they all whispered about was suddenly terribly real. The arena was just the epicenter. The real shockwave was digital. In the seconds after the pop, a new sound began, the sound of 1,000,000 tiny notifications. The internet didn't just break, it evaporated. Social media platforms reported server outages, unable to handle the spike. The clip, filmed on a dozen shaky phones in the front row, was already at 50 million views before the show had even returned from its commercial break. It was the digital equivalent of a nuclear flash. And then the real world took notice. Phones started ringing in newsrooms that usually only covered politics or legitimate sports. Anchors who had dismissed wrestling their entire lives were suddenly being handed index cards by frantic producers trying to explain why this one person's appearance was the #1 trending topic on Earth. It wasn't a wrestling story anymore. It was a cultural event. Back at headquarters, in a sterile corporate boardroom, the mood was electric. They weren't watching the show, they were watching a line graph on a giant screen. Social media engagement, merchandise pre-orders, minute-by-minute ratings. The graph wasn't just climbing, it was a vertical line. They had done it. They had hit the jackpot. But in their celebration, they missed the crucial point. They hadn't created this moment. They had just uncorked a bottle that had been shaking for 5 years, and now they had no idea how to control the explosion they had unleashed. They thought they owned the lightning. They forgot the lightning always strikes the ground. Imagine being the champion. You are, by definition, the main character. You are the one who has defended the title, who has done the media tours, who has closed out the shows. You are the mountain. And then, in a single night, you become an island. The champion sat in her locker room, the gold belt heavy in her lap. It felt different now, colder. An hour ago, it was her validation. Now it was just a target. She watched the replay on the monitor. She saw the adulation. She saw the tears. She heard the pop. And she knew, with a sickening certainty, that none of it was for her. Her entire reign, everything she had built, was just reduced to a single purpose: to be the dragon for the returning hero to slay. She was no longer the star of the show. She was now the villain in someone else's story. And the worst part? She hadn't even done anything. The other wrestlers avoided her gaze as she walked down the hall. They gave her space. It was the kind of space you give someone who has just received terrible news. She wasn't angry. Not yet. She was just isolated. The crowd hadn't just welcomed a hero back. They had, in the same breath, dismissed their current one. The champion was now the second most important person in her own division, and she had to find a way to live with that. The war wasn't coming. It was already here. Hours later, the arena is dark. The trucks are being loaded. The roar has faded into a dull ringing in her ears. She finally sits alone in a sterile, gray hotel room, her gear bag dumped by the door. She kicks off her boots and makes the call she was dreading. It rings twice. A familiar, gravelly voice answers. "I saw it." There's no congratulations. No, "I'm proud of you." Just, "I saw it." A pause hangs in the air, heavier than any championship belt. This is the call home. The call to the legacy. To the family name that she inherited. The name that hangs over her like a shadow. "Are you ready?" the voice asks. She doesn't know how to answer. Ready for what? The matches? She's always ready for the matches, but that wasn't the question. "Are you ready?" he meant. "For the burden? Are you ready for the weight of expectation that this pop just cemented?" That sound tonight wasn't just for her. It was for her father. It was for the dynasty. It was for the memory of what their family name means to this business. She realized the fans weren't just cheering for a returning star. They were cheering for the return of a feeling, a nostalgia, a time when things felt simpler. They were cheering for a ghost, and she, the person in the hotel room with aching knees and a pounding headache, was now expected to be that ghost. "I think so," she whispers. But the voice on the other end knows she's lying. The next day of catering at the following show is a strange and quiet affair. It's the day after, and the atmosphere is thick. She walks in, and the conversations stop. Not in a "star has arrived" kind of way, but in a "teacher has walked into the classroom" way. People are polite. "Great to have you back," one says, not making eye contact. "Incredible moment," says another, before quickly turning back to their plate. She is a living legend, and she is also a complete outsider. The locker room she left behind has moved on. New hierarchies have been formed. New friendships, new rivalries. The women who, just 2 days ago, were the undisputed leaders of the division now feel like they're borrowing space. She didn't just take the main event spot, she took the respect that came with it. And she did it without having been in the trenches with them for the past year. She represents the past. A glorious past, but the past nonetheless. They represent the present. And as she sits down at a table by herself, the divide is clear. They respect the legend, but they resent the woman. They resent the fact that she skipped the line. They resent that all their hard work was erased by one nostalgic chord. She is the ghost at the feast, a reminder that no matter how hard they work, they will never be her. And that resentment is a seed that, in this business, always grows into something ugly. It's 3 a.m., another hotel room, in another city. The glow of the television is the only light, replaying the highlights from her return over and over. She's watching it, but she doesn't recognize the person on the screen. The crowd, the noise, the power. The woman on that stage looks like a goddess, impervious and strong. The woman in the mirror is just tired. The pop, that sound. It was an addiction. She'd been gone for years, telling herself she was happy, telling herself she was free from the grind, but she missed the noise. She needed it. She needed to know they hadn't forgotten her. And now she had it, the loudest pop in history, and it was completely hollow. A sudden cold fear grips her. What if she can't deliver? What if the idea of her is infinitely more powerful than the reality? The fans weren't cheering for the 30-something woman with chronic injuries and a deep-seated fear of failure. They were cheering for the 20-something superhero she used to be. She is now a prisoner of their expectations. Every move she makes will be compared to her past. Every promo will be measured against her legend. That sound, that beautiful, validating roar, it wasn't a welcome. It was a contract, and she just signed it in front of the world, without reading the fine print. She has to be perfect, and for the first time in her life she knows, with absolute certainty, that she isn't. The first meeting back at headquarters isn't in a locker room. It's in a glass-walled conference room on the 18th floor. The men in suits are smiling. They don't call her by her name. They call her the asset. The engagement has been unprecedented, one suit says, pointing to a PowerPoint slide. T-shirt sales have surpassed the entire roster, combined. She nods. She's heard this before. But the tone is different. We're diverting, another suit says, clicking to the next slide. It's a graphic for the next pay-per-view, her face next to the champions. The long-term story you were discussing, that's on hold. We're fast-tracking. The data demands we capitalize on this now. She feels a knot tighten in her stomach. The story she had wanted to tell, a slow burn, a redemption, a struggle to earn her place back, is irrelevant. They don't want a story. They want a moment. They want to cash in on the nostalgia before the inevitable backlash begins. She realizes she isn't in control. She wasn't in control. Her return wasn't her decision. Not really. It was a calculated business move, a break glass in case of emergency button that the company had just pressed. She was a quick fix for a ratings dip. The pop wasn't her victory. It was just the sound of a cash register. She's a commodity, and her value peaked the second her music hit. Now her only job is to not depreciate before the big sale. The hero has become a product. She doesn't find the champion. She finds the veteran, the one who never left, the one who held the division together for 5 years with duct tape and sheer willpower, the one who never ever got a pop like that. She finds her taping her wrists in a quiet, concrete hallway. So, the veteran says, not looking up. You got what you wanted. I came back to help, she replies, the words sounding weak, even to her. The veteran stops taping. She finally looks up, and her eyes are devoid of any warmth. Help? You don't get it, do you? You didn't come back to help. You came back because you couldn't stand it. You couldn't stand watching from home while we did the work. You couldn't stand the idea of them cheering for someone else. That's not true, isn't it? The veteran stands, getting closer. You needed to know you still had it. You needed that sound, that validation. Because you're an addict. We all are. But you're the one who got clean and then decided to come back and burn the whole rehab center down just to feel that high one more time. The truth of it hits her like a physical blow. The return wasn't for the fans. It wasn't for the business. It wasn't even for the title. It was for her. It was an act of profound, desperate selfishness. They're not cheering you, the veteran says quietly, turning to leave. They're cheering a memory, and when they realize you're just a person, they're going to turn on you, and we'll be the ones left to clean up the mess, again. The story we're told is about her. The return, the pop, the road to the championship. We've seen it 100 times. We accept it. But what if we're watching the wrong story? Let's go back. Go back to the pop. Freeze the frame. Look past her silhouette in the entranceway. Look into the crowd. Don't look at the people cheering. Look at the people crying. Look at the faces. That is not just happiness. It is raw, unfiltered relief. This is the twist. The story isn't about her. It's about them. The loudest pop in SmackDown history wasn't a celebration. It was a scream. It was the sound of a fan base that had been starved for months, maybe years, starved of compelling stories, of heroes they could believe in, of moments that felt real. They weren't cheering because she was back. They were cheering because they finally had something, anything to believe in. Her return didn't break history. It just exposed the cracks in the foundation. It revealed how desperate the audience was for a savior. That sound wasn't for her. It was a cry for help. And she, the returning legend, the corporate asset, the locker room ghost, she just walked into the middle of it. She thinks this is her story of redemption. She doesn't realize she's just a bandage on a broken system. The real story, the terrifying one, is what happens next. What happens when the pop fades? And the fans realize they're one. Last hero can't save them either.